One of the most consequential short story collections of the last 20 years, perhaps since the turn of the century. We have 10th of December by George Saunders. Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the maybe final video in the 10th of December playlist here on the channel. This will also appear in the Five Thoughts playlist as well as the George Saunders playlist here on the channel. I don't really have a whole lot put together for this video, but I wanted to get in here and have some thoughts on the short story collection as a whole, because there are some things worth talking about on the overall level, maybe the meta level, if you will. And George Saunders is a writer that has a very clear voice, and that comes through in his work. He describes his own journey as a writer kind of as experimental. His professors, I believe it was at Syracuse, he went to Syracuse, described in a very prestigious program there, they described his acceptance as experimental, and you can see that in his writing. The number one thing here on the top of that list, Five Thoughts on 10th of December by George Saunders, is drugs and space cadets. Now, drugs aren't necessarily a main theme through all of the George Saunders that I have read, but they are kind of in this short story collection. Space cadets, that's something I think you could argue is a theme for George Saunders overall. He writes characters that are very difficult to understand at times, but who are very easy with which to empathize. So you find these characters that he has put on the page, and you can't really get in their head as much as you can understand them. They make decisions that you would not. They make decisions that are obvious and flawed at the top, but they are decisions that fuel the stories for what that's worth. There's a lot of writers, I think, that have a tendency to let their characters wander into something. George Saunders, more than anything else, his characters force the short story. He writes short stories that are almost sitcom in their nature, in the way that the characters do make the decisions that drive these stories. The drugs aspect of this, I think, might be a bit of a reflection on Americana as it has become. The sort of prescription drug epidemic that has really overtaken the healthcare discussion in this country. The idea that, no, you're probably not going to be okay. We're going to give you some pills to pop down your throat, and that'll probably do enough. You even have something as loosely connected to this as the Neuralink Light substitute in the Simplica Girl Diaries, whereby these young girls from other countries are made into lawn ornaments through a filament that goes through their brain, in order to get themselves a better life, in order to make some money to take home at the end of their tenure as Simplica Girls. One thing that I thought that short story could have used would have been a little bit of dark, perhaps, foreshadowing as to whether or not the Simplica Girls actually made their way back home at the end of their kind of semi-career. It was an interesting sort of journey into what I think that you can sort of transpose that short story onto the cam girl phenomenon that is on the internet these days, in that these are women from disadvantaged countries that are just putting their bodies on display and hoping to make money for their family. That would have been an interesting twist, a couple interesting twists for that short story. But overall, the drugs and space cadets idea is something that is pervasive through this short story collection. Maybe with the main character in 10th of December, if you suggest that the child character is the main character in 10th of December, he's a space cadet, but the rest of the story is kind of straightforward. The other characters in the story are kind of straightforward. And then Styx is, and maybe Puppy. Maybe there's not a whole lot of space cadet action in Puppy, but I think that the mother character, both of the mother characters in that short story are not present. And I think that that translates at least a little bit to what it means to be a space cadet. They are not present in their lives and in the lives of their loved ones, but they do make efforts towards those other characters. The number 2 thing here, the dark humor of flawed human experience. There is dark humor in each and every one of these short stories, often when calling into relation those space cadets and those drugs. But the overarching sort of dark humor to George Saunders writ large is something that is kind of jolting in literature, kind of jolting to find, kind of gives you the harumph when you are reading it. And I think it is an aspect of George Saunders' writing that can kind of make it difficult and perhaps impenetrable. Because if you don't have the reading experience to recognize the humor in that darkness, the humor that is obviously being deployed by George Saunders, a lot of these short stories just kind of come across as extremely negative. When you think of the characters that are trying to make life better for themselves only to be foiled at every turn, it can come across as something which is halting. It can come across as something which is negative. It can come across as something which is not fun to read without the full transparency of the writing that it is meant to, you're supposed to laugh. A lot of dark humor is this way, but George Saunders deploys dark humor in a way that is almost slapstickish, and that makes it, I think, for less experienced readers, certainly when I first found George Saunders, confusing in tonality. The number 3 thing there, deceptively difficult to read. You can open it up to any page in this short story compilation, and a lot of times, one of the things that I have heard is that good writing teaches you how to read it. Oftentimes with George Saunders' short stories, it's the opening of the short story that is particularly difficult, and I tried to figure out if that is because of is that because the world into which we are being thrust has a little bit of explaining to be done, or if that is by design by George Saunders in order to get the reader over the hump and into the rest of the story. A lot of this comes from less than intelligent or less than articulate first-person narratives, which are just sort of inevitably jolting. But part of it is, I think, is effort on behalf of George Saunders to make things in a meta way as confusing to the reader as the protagonist is confused in the story. Being confused at the onset of the story in the same way that the protagonist, his or herself, is kind of confused at life is an interesting way to is an interesting way to bond the reader to the story, if not the protagonist themselves. It's an interesting take, and I think that it is something which is only possible because of the niching down that literature has gone through. I don't think George Saunders exists in the 1950s. Certainly, no George Saunders was around in the 1950s as far as writing is concerned. I don't think his work would have taken off in the way that it has without the secular shifts at the university level, at the creative writing program university level in particular, that has happened. All of this experimental type stuff that has worked its way into the canon of current American letters sort of paved the way for a voice like George Saunders to exist. George Saunders being so experimental, George Saunders being so nearly impenetrable, if you're not willing to throw your hands up and say, okay, we're just going to get through these first few pages of this short story and see if we can figure it out. If you're not willing to do that, the writing isn't any good. And prior to, possibly now, I don't know that this writing would have been accepted at the university level. I don't know that it would have seen publication. Certainly there have always been experimental voices, but coherence is usually at the top of the list as far as readability is concerned. And I think that certainly there are short stories in this collection whereby coherence is not first and foremost, and coherence is certainly not the introduction to the short story. So there's that. The number 4 point I want to make here, consistency of voice is good. That's one of the things that George Saunders definitely has nailed down. However, over the course of an entire collection of short stories, consistency of characters is boring. Consistency of characters between characters in the same short story is boring as well. As one of the big sort of criticisms I have of George Saunders and why at times his writing, I think that you have to read George Saunders one thing at a time. One short story in the week, and you're good. Lincoln in the Bardo, for example, for me was a miserable sort of experience because all of those characters were kind of the same. The level of aloof that Saunders is fond of writing into his characters is something that can be off-putting when it's too much at once. Lincoln in the Bardo for me was too experimental an experience. I didn't think that the experimental setup of the novel benefited the story, and within that, the fact that the characters kind of all have the same voice between themselves is off-putting. So can you, from 10th of December, name a favorite character? One character. Al Rooston maybe comes to mind, but I don't think that even Al Rooston is someone who stands apart enough from this collection to give it the weight necessary that it stands out. I don't think that anyone is going to read George Saunders and come away with the level of reverence that they have for certain characters the way that you come away from, say, William Faulkner with reverence for characters. I think that plays into the secular, again, to go back to the secular shifts in literature. This is a short story compilation called 10th of December. There is one mention, I think, Maybe I'm wrong, in the entire thing of Christmas, which, hey, look, you don't have to mention Christmas just because the compilation is called 10th of December. But, and that was in, I think that was in Styx, the mention of Christmas was in Styx. But what you're doing with that is you are drawing attention to the time of year and separating yourself from the Americana of Christmas, which is fine. But the compounding effects of that, with the secular shift away from standout people, the way, and the secular trend is that you don't have to believe me. I have a master's degree that is useless because of the focus in academe right now is not on exceptionalism. The focus in academe right now is saying, hey, everyone's kind of the same and everyone sucks. Okay, if that's the way you want to say things, the focus in academe, for example, in the historical context, there used to be something called the great man theory of history, which is that every once in a while a great person comes along and really pushes things forward. The Abraham Lincolns of the world, go back to Lincoln's Bardo. Things would not have been the same without Abraham Lincoln. The prevailing paradigm right now in teaching history is kind of that, everything would have happened eventually anyway. We would have come to nuclear power without the Manhattan Project. It just would have taken longer. We would have gotten to the general theory of relativity without Einstein. It just would have taken longer. People were kind of on the precipice even when Einstein was alive. He just put together all of the little dots. That has soaked through into George Saunders. And none of his characters stand out. None of his characters are exceptional. None of his characters are particularly characters of metal. Not that I have read. In all of the short stories that I have read from George Saunders, you can be flawed but still be strong. Read William Faulkner, and that's all there. But this melding together, in my mind, of basically every character in this collection leaves me wanting. Certainly, George Saunders is talented enough of a writer to have done something with these characters and made them exceptional, made them memorable. But the stories are what we remember, at least as far as I know or can tell, from the collection of 10th of December, as well as, in my opinion, the greater canon of George Saunders. The last talking point that I have here, a solid 10-story collection. I don't know that I can necessarily pick out a favorite from this short story collection, which isn't a bad thing. But I don't think that I can pick out one that is definitely the worst. There are ones that kind of drag on. There are ones that feel a little bit redundant. You look at this collection of short stories, and I think that you come out Victory Lap, Styx, Puppy, Escape from Spiderhead, Exhortation, Al Rooston, The Simplica Girl Diaries, Home, My Chivalric Fiasco, and 10th of December. I think that your bottom tier are probably Exhortation, Home, Exhortation and My Chivalric Fiasco. Home is one of the ones that if you were allowing a generous reading of that short story might be the best, but I think that overall it gets lost in this collection. I think that overall, while it does have a character that is kind of a space cadet in his own way, as well as his mother and semi-stepfather are space cadets, as well as the chief of police that comes to his house. They're all kind of space cadets, and it does have questionably the drug element. It fits into this short story collection, but I think that it had the potential to have a lot more heart than we get from this collection. I think that Escape from Spiderhead and the Simplica Girl Diaries are the best short stories in this collection on an overall basis. They're also short stories that aren't really all that short in 38 and 60 pages of literature. But anyway, that is 5 thoughts that I have on 10th of December by George Saunders. If you like this sort of thing, hit the like and subscribe. There's always literature to be had on the channel. This is in the 10th of December playlist where I went short story by short story through the collection. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.